In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, distinguished guests, our audience from the different media platforms, we'd like to welcome you here to the Center for Research and Policy Studies. So we're going to move to the second session of today. So the second session that is going to be undertaken under the title of Gulf Cultural Strategies and Cultural Institutions. So, in other words, what groups think about and try to reflect on the ground, these are a reflection of a whole culture, and this can only be also a reflection of the distribution of power in the community. In the GCC, the oil growth has been able to enable the people to establish advanced institutions and also to develop different spheres and realms in the community. So, institutions and cultural centers have not been yet successful in achieving a knowledge based and a cultural revolution. So, the question that I would like to pose was the institutions or were the institutions not able to achieve the change that is sought, and what are the impediments that stand between these institutions and cultural reform? I would like to welcome Mr. Said Al Tarshi, Mr. Khaled AlKhaldi, and researcher Abdulrahman Al-Marri. And I am honored, my name Maryam Al-Kuwari, to moderate this session. We're going to give 15 minutes to each and every speaker in this session. And after that, we're going to open the floor for the attendees to pose their questions. So we're going to start with Mr. Said Al Tarshi from the Gulf and Omani Cultural Strategies Center. So he's going to talk about Gulf and Omani Cultural Strategies, a comparative critical analysis. So we're going to talk about the latest developments when it comes to strategic work. He is the editor in chief of Al Thaqafa magazine issued by the Ministry of Culture. Mr. Said, go ahead. Microphone, please. Thank you very much, Dr. Maryam. I would like to thank you very much. And I'm going to speak today about the strategy of culture, Omani culture 2021-2040. And I would like to talk about the GCC strategy 2030. And as you can see from this title, we have the methodology of the study that is going to be followed. It is an analytical methodology where we analyze the two texts and also a critical and comparative study of the two strategies, and also to compare two components of the strategy with other regional strategies and also belonging to other Arab countries such as the Palestinian cultural strategy and also the strategy of the National Council of Kuwait and the Jordanian strategy and other regionally strategies such as the Islamic World Strategy and also the strategy of the Arab Organization for Education and Science. So the different components of this study, the first component that I would like to talk about is to define the two strategies. And I would like to go back to the first slide. This is the first slide. So the different items that I concentrated on. So we have an introduction, and also we have 5 other components in order to verify the proposition that was presented in the introduction. So I would like to talk and introduce the two strategies and also the historical context in which the two strategies have been prepared. Second, we would like to introduce what is culture and strategic definitions and the role of culture in development and the importance of such strategy. Number three, we have to analyze the ecosystem of the two institutions. Number four, we have to analyze the components of the two plans or strategies, the vision, the mission, the values, and then the third component is an analysis of the objectives and the programs and so on and so forth. So this is the hypothesis, and here I am not giving answers. What I try to do is to pose questions and also about cultural work in the GCC and in particular in Oman, and also the joint GCC effort that is exerted by the institutions of the General Secretariat. And from reading the different texts of the two strategies, I found that there isn't a clear-cut use of culture and also the different concepts that are relevant to this definition. And when it comes to strategic planning, so if this exists as a practice, what we notice is that this has not yet been transformed into values when it comes to the practice of culture. There is another question. So, are the two strategies able to meet the requirements of the coming phase, the cultural requirements, and what comes after that? And amongst the things that are witnessed is that the two strategies in the two strategies, there is an absence of logical presentation and also the presentation of a number of comprehensive concepts that we should differentiate from others. So this is the first component. So we're going to talk about the definition of the two strategies. So we would like to have a larger level of interaction. And as I said at the beginning, I'm not going to present absolute and final answers with regard to the strategies. So what I'm going to do is to pose questions relevant to the text of the two strategies. With regard to the definition of culture, so there are scores of definitions of culture. These definitions have started, and the most famous of which are definitions such as this one, which is the definition of Tyler. And after that, we have had many other definitions. Amongst these definitions, I have chosen a number of definitions. These definitions is another definition by Max Weber and Frederick Schiller, and another definition by the UNESCO. Of course, my choice of such definitions is founded because the two strategies witness a lack of justification of certain concepts. So, as an example, there isn't a definition or a specific definition when it comes to the concept of culture in the GCC cultural strategy, and this has made the situation not very clear when it comes to formulating the objects and the programs and activities. And before that, to define the sector of culture as a whole. So that is why these two institutions are not very clear as to how much they would present to us when it comes to the realm of culture. So we would like also to concentrate in this paper on on culture and its developmental role. So these are some of the observations that I have written, and I have taken texts from the two strategies. These underline the position vis-à-vis these two strategies. So strategic planning. When it comes to strategic planning, so it is one of the administrative procedures.
So far as the history of strategic planning in the GCC countries and the General Secretariat, this is all in 1987. The first plan was made, that was renewed in 2008, and then in 2019 the last strategy was issued. In Oman, strategic planning was late. In 2021 was the first strategy which was published in Oman. But strategic planning or long-term planning, we had the tactical planning, the 5-yearly plans, was known in the Sultanate from 1976. The first developmental plan was published, but it focused on the economic side. Ahmed Al-Falahi, in an article, called for long-term planning. In an article he published in an Omani newspaper, and then he published it in a book called... Some 20 years ago, he called for the necessity of long-term planning for managing and administering the cultural aspect of life in the Sultanate. And the two strategies, and maybe this applies to many other Arab institutions, what was mentioned in Palestine also. In Palestine, the strategic planning concept says that strategic planning did not really rise up to the aspirations. This is just a theoretical thing. We have plans, we are asked to come up with plans, we set forth the plans, but when it comes to implementation, then that's another story. Now I move to the third element, and that is analyzing the environment of the two institutions. I said before there is a dilemma here, and in planning, in strategic planning, we apply the SWOT analysis before the Omani cultural strategy or the Gulf cultural strategy is applied. But when we read the two strategies, we notice that the concept of the sector of culture is not really identified. And in the Gulf strategy, the body in charge of implementation is the General Cultural Committee, which was established by the General Secretariat of the GCC. In the Sultanate of Oman, the picture isn't clearer. Sometimes it's part of the Ministry of Youth, Sport and Culture. Sometimes it's looked at as a bigger cultural sector within the state, and that the all state institutions are in charge of that. Sometimes it even is extended to the civil society, so there is some confusion here as to what about the concept of culture and also the application of the SWOT analysis in the workings of the two institutions. The SWOT analysis, the points of strength and points of strength are known. They are done within the institution, and the opportunities are done outside the institution. This is the basic nature of the SWOT analysis. The Gulf strategies, the three elements of points of weakness and strength speak about it outside the institution and outside the Gulf states, and sometimes some points of weakness can be points of strength and vice versa, like cultural openness can be a point of strength and at the same time a point of weakness. So there is confusion and the clarification is not there about these concepts. So the analysis confuses what is within the institution and what's from outside it, and is not applied to the institution which is in charge of implementing the two strategies, which is in the Sultanate of Oman, which is the Ministry of Youth, Culture, and at the GCC level, the committee. So the points of weakness talk in generalities about things which are absent, maybe in society, maybe in the state as a whole, maybe within the ministry itself. Now I move to the basic elements of any strategy. As you know, the basic elements these are agreed on. 1 minute. These elements are the vision, the mission, the values, strategic values. What is noticed about the Omani cultural strategy talks about Oman trying to build a civilized human being or citizen with an identity. And this leads to a question. What does established identity mean? Is there such thing as established identity? And also the other question about the vision. What about creative human being? There is no clear definition of that. Also, when it comes to the concept of leading or pioneering, these descriptions are the standards of formulating any vision depend on the ability to implement them. So is the Omani strategy meant to be a leader or a pioneer? In both strategies, when it comes to the values, there is confusion between social values, which control behavior of human beings and the relationship between them and with others, and what the values of the institution. The values, they have quite a few values. Normally, it's not more than 3 or 4, and they are not individual and to do with the behavior of individuals. They reflect the culture of the institutional culture. The chairperson is looking at me. she's looking at me as a reminder of the time. And one final point, this is as for the objectives and the themes and the projects and etc. The Gulf strategy has an implementation plan. It is there, but what we talked about so far as the lack of clarity, ambiguity of these concepts makes it necessary to rediscuss them again, and also for the Omani cultural strategy, we see that concepts are repeated without any clear distinction between them, and this will undoubtedly lead to confusion in the functions and implementation. And this is what is really happening now. These are the different aims and objectives. You find one element which is repeated in more than one, and this is reflected in the implementation plan. So you see a repetition. Uh, uh, please make it your final point. I reached the conclusion that the problem I set out to discuss is correct. These two strategies lack certain aspects, and the lack of clarity is especially evident when it comes to the concept of culture, and whether we talk about the general definition or specific definition in the Gulf region, which confines it to arts and things. I call for an annual forum to discuss the cultural strategies in the Gulf countries, and also to discuss and revise maybe certain aspects, especially to the. And thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you, Said. A very nice idea to organize a forum for studying the. I looked at you just to encourage you to finish off, not to terrorize you. Now we move from planning to implementation. Maybe Mr. Khaled has something to say about the role of the cultural institutions, but his paper is entitled Cultural Institutions in Kuwait from Rise to Fall, and he will discuss the situation in Kuwait from 1990 onwards, although Kuwait represented a resurgence in the cultural scene, and he uses in his analysis the different resources and why culture is on the retreat. Khaled AlKhaldi holds an MA from Doha Institute and BA from Islamic Studies faculty in the University of Kuwait, and he is concerned with social aspects of life and culture. Mr. Khaled, you have 15 minutes. This paper emanates from a saying that cultural institutions in Kuwait have seen a lot of movement backwards and stagnation from the point of view of having an influence outside Kuwait and the political support, and especially in the influence in Qatar, UAE, and lately Saudi Arabia. I discuss also the making of culture at the level of Gulf countries, and at the level of the culture being exported abroad. And this is a desire by the ruling elite to present themselves in a picture. In the days of Arab pan-nationalism, the Gulf countries used to export a picture that they are part and parcel of the Arab region and pan-Arabism. When the situation changed, the image was presented differently. Now, the state in Kuwait is aware of itself when it plans for certain cultural policies. It knows what it's doing. This is based on awareness, and it allows for writing history, the type of national identity. So there are some means of controlling that. I chose the case of Kuwait because Kuwait represents a model which was accomplished and completed, then started to fall. And in Kuwait, this was linked to the relatively early independence of Kuwait by some 10 years compared to other Arab countries. And also, there was a small community, some sort of a civil society in Kuwait before the age of petrol, and this was based on many elements. First, there is a commercial class and enlightened class whose members got educated in India and in Iraq, and there are some families which are present in Basra, Kuwait, and Bahrain, and they used to mix with the cultural elites in Basra, India, or Bahrain. And also, I give a historical narration of the beginnings of culture in Kuwait in the pre-oil era, but the institutions by and large relied on personal finance or donations by merchants, so they could not continue. And because of the economic situation in Kuwait and in the Gulf region in general, then I moved to the question of what we call the age of hegemony in the post-oil. Oil in Kuwait gave the state the amount of power and strength because of the revenues, and no matter how strong the civil society was or how merchants or intellectuals were, the state was stronger, and the state started planning nationalizing the public spaces, whether political, social, or cultural. So the state created societies according to their own visions. They brought certain sections closer to it, and also distance themselves from others in accordance to the political elites' behavior at that time. One of the things that the state planned to have control on and to start new cultural institutions. What are the institutions which are there now? Some are linked to the history, like in 1959 the state formed a committee to write a history for the country in accordance to the state's narrative, so that the history of Kuwait is not written by others who do not understand it, quote unquote. And this committee was headed by Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad, who became Amir later on. He was called the Committee of Guidance, and this is at the local level. They also try to export a certain image abroad. My paper discusses and focuses on these institutions which were charged with exporting the image abroad. First of all, before the independence of Qatar, there was Kuwait, sorry, there was the Pan-Arabist movement, and when Kuwait became independent, Kuwait, sorry, did not want to belong to any of the accesses formed by the British, and tried to stand by the pan-nationalist movements. They sent the students to Egypt, and there were links, political links between Kuwait and Egypt, and which proved very useful when the Abdul Karim Qasim crisis with Iraq started. This proved very useful at the time in Kuwait. The regime in Kuwait was described as a reactionary regime, etc., etc. The most important thing was making Kuwait part of the Arab cultural map, and the Arab intellectuals who had a presence in the media, and also the liberal elites, educated elites in Kuwait, and mostly they studied outside Kuwait in a pre-oil era, and the Council of Education sent a relatively large number of students to study in Egypt. These elites, by and large, had a pan-Arabist political view and liberal at the social and intellectual level. So they started clubs, newspapers outside Kuwait. And when the pan-Arabism was on the rise and there were military coups throughout in the Arab world, the state started fearing these elites, although it sent them to study abroad. So they tried to find them a space and for them to exercise power and influence without harming the state politically. And these elites had a mission in life to spread pan-Arabism and spread culture in the Arab world. Al Bayan newspaper or magazine, the chief editor in Sudan used to say, like, this was in the 80s, and Egypt had just joined the Camp David agreements, and he said that we used to import knowledge from Egypt. Now we must continue Egypt's path and to spread Arab culture and to pay back the debt we owe to these countries. The other thing is the political elites in a country like Kuwait. The political struggle between political elites changes the social aspects of life, and there is a struggle over the internal divisions over who should rule the country from within the ruling family, and they wanted to present themselves. They established the kind of clubs, and they wanted to appear in the public space in a way which allows it to have some sort of publicity and propaganda for itself. So they supported the intellectuals, and also the establishment of newspapers meant that they have cultural pages, and they imported Najil Ali, Ghassan Kanafani, Ahmed Matar, and others, and other artists, plastic arts, etc. They came to Qatar because there was political financing of newspapers which required people. And then after 1990, after 1990, the idea of pan-Arabism has come to its end in Kuwait. At the level of at the social level, practice level, it was ended. It may remain as an ideology in the minds of some, and most political elites after the invasion, and some publications started writing about this. The efforts Kuwaitis have exerted and the contributions to Arab culture, and expressed disappointment with pan-Arabism because of the invasion. And of course, this is linked to other political developments. Pan-Arabism has almost disappeared in the Arab world. Also, the educated liberal elite has changed because the demographic changes and the intellectual changes. We saw a rise in the 1980s of Islamic revision and Islamic revivalism. And the whole society moved towards the religiosity, in fact, and these elites, the liberal elites, have their institutions, but at the political level now there is no liberal person who can present any idea in parliament. Now the struggle is between the right and the extreme right. And also the other important factor, we saw a retreat so far as the awareness of political elites. Also the sheikhs who appeared in the pan-national, pan-Arabism and the importance of Arabic culture, mostly they died, and the political class now is very localized, and all their concerns have nothing to do with any ideology or intellectual aspects. Their struggle is on benefits and interest. So therefore, there is hardly anybody from the, for example, from the political elite starting an award for book writing or translation or something. There are awards, yes, and the National Committee for the Arts, but the encyclopedia and others, which was the last pillar of Kuwait's pride and in culture, has stopped, and nobody is even wondering why. This is a summary of the paper and the reasons which led to building institutions in Kuwait have ended, and today we are on the retreat, and there is lack of interest, whether at the level of parliament or the intellectuals or the liberal elite.
Thank you very much, Khaled. You talked about a point that made me curious about capital in the GCC. We see that some GCC countries, they're like incubators for those capitals. So what about the role of traders that used to exist in Kuwait and their support for the cultural scene? So why we have seen a regression in terms of the support given by those uh, capitals here in the state of Qatar. So this speaker, Abdulrahman Al-Marri, was going to talk about the cultural horizon fused on the inadequacy of the shared space between the individual and the cultural institution in Qatar. He's going to talk about the cultural scene in the state of Qatar and the development of the institutions and creating the space for expression and the position of individuals and to what extent these cultural institutions reflect the challenges that they face. So Abdulrahman Al-Marri, assistant researcher from Ibn Khaldun Center from Qatar University. He concentrates on culture and policies in the GCC. Thank you very much, Maryam. So the first impression that the reader gets when he sees the title of this paper, he will see that there is a kind of a common sphere or ground between these institutions, but also the paper supposes that there is a kind of a shortcoming when it comes to this component. So there is a new methodology that was undertaken in order to diagnose the pathway of the different institutions in the state of Qatar. So the paper does not claim to build any theoretical kind of construct to cover other components, and the outcome of the analysis of paper includes certain explanations of certain neighboring cultural institutions. There are two main components when it comes to this paper. So, which the first one is to try to understand the cultural sphere in the state of Qatar, and this component is closely linked another component which looks at the different rules that are very important indeed. So I pose questions about this component, and although questions were based on a number of contemplations that we carried out, so there are four main meanings that are the parameters of this study. So the cultural sphere is the one that establishes the relationship between the political, the economic, and historical components, and it is a direct or indirect component of the accumulation attractions of the same of these components to each other, and also to concentrate on the historical role of these kind of matters. And it is a kind of a compass for the points of priority in order to strike a balance between them. So the cultural sphere represents and means whereby we understand the different trends that might arise. So I think we should understand the tools and the duty of these institutions, and this is a very intricate matter, and perhaps this leads me perhaps to concentrate on other more important issues. That is why I will not tackle this point, although from a theoretical perspective it is very important. But I would like to pose another question. Have the institutions played a role in order to understand this role, or to concentrate only on the production? No. We concentrated on both aspects because this is a compounded kind of role that I would like to underline. So the mechanism that is used by these institutions since the establishment of these institutions have been very strict indeed when it comes to the production of such activities. There are a number of exceptional kind of activities, such as the one that was carried out by Al Jasra, and this mechanism has become stricter or more strict when it comes to the project of the cultural strategy that was established by the state. This is a developmental project that was very, very deep when it comes to the role of the state. So that is why there have been two main kind of hypotheses. So talking about the common sphere since the 90s, and that includes the different platforms in which persons would be able to express themselves about their entourage and time in a verbal way and a written way, and also the different kinds of practices when it comes to culture, and also to allocate a margin when it comes to this relationship of exchange that tries to attract the emerging kind of energies. So there is a component that has been used very much in the writings, particularly when it to do with sociology. We talk about CSOs, or civil society organizations. I think that the use of such kind of concepts in understanding the particularity of the GCC case, this has led to a number of misleading condemnations. I think the use of this term in the way it is prevalent in the literature that concentrated on the GCC aspects, it is an attempt to use a kind of certain terminology that are not going to be useful if there is no theoretical framework on the ground. So there are a number of models that have been used when it comes to the phenomenon of the tribe or mother communities. So communities are much more modern, as it was underlined by Brother Khaled AlKhaldi. The second hypothesis, so the internal components have impacted the interactions, and that is why we do not have an equation between the internal and external demands. And this, in actual fact, leads us to the structural factors and the pressures that the state had been subjected to from an internal perspective. That is why the larger historical pathway has led to a number of limited initiatives when it comes to culture, despite the fact that we have seen legislations that have been developed in order for them to be much larger. And as a result of that is that the larger burden is on the official cultural institutions when it comes to cultural production, and this had led to a compounded burden on those institutions, which started relying on a number of priorities in keeping with the policies of the state. So this nascent kind of phenomenon has led to a lack of interesting relationship, non-interactive relationship between those institutions and individuals. And as a result of that, we have seen a new sphere which has been transformed into a performance role. This has led some to try to hide behind those institutions within the program that was established, and some others were trying to come up with a number of parallel kind of activities. So this lack of interest is still one of the traits that is typical to the relationship between individuals and the cultural institutions of the state. I would like to talk about the problematic, and perhaps I would not have the time to talk about some of the literatures that have been tackled, or to talk about the theoretical framework where I try to come up with a new approach. So this is an approach, it's a bottom-up approach. So the problematic that we try to underline in the paper, so when the state moved into advanced levels when it comes to services and infrastructure and achieving great results when it comes to its strategic projects. So the investments that have been made in the different vital sectors have not been reflected in the cultural spheres. So this entails that we should understand the historical component and the role of the cultural aspects and manifestations. That is why it is legitimate to pose questions about the role of these institutions that should move from expressions of institutional and semi-institutional institutions. And if these institutions, they try to reflect these roles through the pillars such as the customary values, religion, and so on and so forth. So what about the role that should be undertaken? So what has led to diminishing this role, and how can we strike a balance between the needs of the community and the burden on the state? I do not know if we have enough time, but I'm going to try to give you a general idea about the cultural institutions. So the first department in modern Qatari state was established in order to meet the requirements of culture, and that was passed part of the Ministry of Information or Media. And after that, this department was made separate, and the cultural aspect remained one of its specializations, and after that we have seen the establishment of the cultural center until the Ministry of Culture, Arts and Heritage was established. And after that there was an Emiri decree that was issued and talking about these institutions and regulating them. And after that, there was another amendment in order to establish a new Ministry of Culture and a separate ministry which is in charge of culture, in charge of sports and youth, sorry. That is why we have two main historical pathways that the institutions have moved from initiatives, institutional and semi-institutional initiatives, into a new kind of pathway that would regulate and organize culture and integrate culture into the projects of the state. When it comes to the role of those institutions, cultural institutions, yes, they take it incumbent on them to take this burden in keeping with the number of programs. There have been a number of channels in organizing celebrations of the National Day and also try to reinforce those common spheres. And this was based on the national kind of narrative that is very clear cut, whereby it expresses the general framework of the identity of the state. We have religion, common history, and customary values. So the ministry relies on this narrative in all of its activities and programs that it produced in the last 3 decades. But with regard to how this would reflect the culture of the state in different components of the community, there are two fields in order to meet the needs of culture. And we have also the strategic level, which is based on the historical capabilities in order to develop the state from a knowledge-based perspective and cultural perspective. So the state try to develop all these spheres based on the narrative of the state. But with regard to the second sphere of expression, it was not able to achieve tangible steps taken into account the needs of this particular phase. And this is not a failure because this entails to be specific about what would make us say that it failed. But there are so many other reasons that are very, very complex indeed that entail that there should be that we should take into account the transformations that are taking place and also to meet the different demands of the state and the community. So these are the reasons, and here I'm going to conclude my intervention. We have one of the main components. We have the demographic component as opposed to the grand ambitions of the states and also the requirements when it comes to the state. So that is why it was incumbent to look into those priorities that impacted the different circles of cultural production. And also we have the prevalence of the political dimension based on the level of competitiveness and also this kind of component does not reflect something that is local or regional. This is a global phenomenon and that is deeply rooted in the last 10 or 100 years. And this was manifested in many philosophical and intellectual experiences. And here I would like to talk about the experience that one Carl Schmitt talked about when he saw the impact of political impact when he talked about the concept of politics. And also Heidegger also talked about these concerns. He expressed such concern not only when it comes to the prevalence of politics, but also the essence of technology as a method or a way of thinking that includes a number of components. And this is not a reflection of a local phenomenon. No, it is an international phenomenon. Well, there is another matter which is important also. So the diversification of sources of income for it to be able to meet the needs that are required. So that is why the normal horizontal sphere of development has stopped, not the vertical one, which is a kind of an accumulative process. So we have had four main traits. We have the phase between 2008 till date, such as the flows of income and revenue as a result of gas. And also this has led the explosion of the consumption market. And I would like to talk about two kinds of spheres or spaces. We have the traditional national memory with all its manifestations, and also an attempt to reinforce the different practices that are related to it. And we have another sphere which is linked to the market. These two spheres were very important indeed. That is why we see the impact of this common ground when it comes to what is happening, although this is not very costly. So we have seen the cost that now the state can cover. And we have seen also many not attempting to work on this due to the impact and also the burden that comes without any incentives. And I would like to conclude here. Thank you very much, Abdulrahman. There is a point that I would like to clarify when it comes to cultural expression. So we live in the digital age, so technology in itself is a manifestation of culture. So perhaps the different social media platforms try to express or try to cater for what is missing as means and ways or platforms of expression. So now we would like to move to your questions. So there are so many questions. I'm going to use the same method of Dr. Aisha, try to give the opportunity to both right and left. So we start with the right. Yes, Said, go ahead. Microphone, please. So we take the questions, and after that, we come back to you. Thank you very much, Dr. Maryam. And I would like to thank also the different speakers who have enriched the discussion. My question is to Mr. Khaled. Thank you very much for this panoramic explanation of culture in Kuwait. I would like to ask you when culture has been transformed in Kuwait from a value to a method or a tool. And the transformation that we have seen in Kuwait when it comes to culture from a value to a means, this what was used in the GCC in general. And my question to Mr. Said. So, talking about the two strategies that you have presented, who has set these strategies? Have the relevant people been consulted? Are we talking about administrators, who has been consulted? People who practice culture. The same applies to Oman. Who sets the Omani strategy? Dr. Ali. And after that, we come back to you, Dr. Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Dr. Ali Ashawi from the Department of Sociology from Qatar University. Very important topics, but my question to Dr. Al-Khalidi. So Kuwait in the past was a model of culture, and culture created tolerance, and because the agencies were independent, they were not brought from outside the state. But now the situation is different altogether. This is impacting rights. So, where is the culture that does not give us the opportunity to achieve justice and development? So, the democracy of Kuwait is no longer a model to be emulated. I think that the economic and political structure is the one that decides upon culture. So we have what is called the culture of herds. So those who leave the herd are being criticized. Dr. Muhammad and Dr. Bakr. If you allow me, I have a comment. This is a general comment, if you allow me. First of all, I think that the papers that have been presented are very rich and very useful indeed. And that is why when we read these papers, perhaps the process would be much easier. We have an old problematic that still is with us when it comes to the concept of culture, what it means. But from what I know, at least the outcomes of culture is what we should think about. Communities that have a culture, there are going to be less traffic problems, accidents, respect for others. And also, they're going to have like political insights. I have my own concept. I tell them that culture is like a showcase, a glass full showcase where we would be able to see the nice products and symbols. When you get closer, you bump into yourself into glass. What I would like to say here in Kuwait, and particularly in the 70s, there are 3 points that I propose to my colleagues, particularly the young ones, if they want to read about it. So the first component, we have 25 volumes that have been produced in the 70s, and they talk about the public strategy of Arab culture. And those who want to write about culture should perhaps read this kind of book. And also, when it comes to dictionaries and glossaries, the latest of which was produced once again as Zubaydi Taj Al Arus. And I also want to say that there are two important works in Kuwait. We have the crisis of civilizational development. This is an event or a book that was written, and it is very important indeed. And in 2014, we went back to it once again, and we talked about the crisis of civilization. And we noticed that in 1974, so two main things have not been mentioned: media and economy. And here I would like to say that it is important to witness the community develop, but it should include these components. If you allow me, I'm going to conclude, yes. But I think that there is another point that I would like to bring to your attention is that we have what is called a transit kind of culture. So, yes, a book is issued, you read the book through the internet. So, in actual fact, the synthesis why cultural work has gone backward, I think that there is a very important phenomenon. One of the members of the Ummah Council in Kuwait read in one of the Kuwaiti newspapers that there is a lecture by Jalaluddin al-Rumi about Jalaluddin al-Rumi, and he said that I told the Minister of Interior that he should not give a visa to Jalaluddin al-Rumi. And after that, that person was appointed as an official in charge of culture. My question is to Mr. Said Al Tarshi. So, cultural work has suffered a great deal in Oman as a result of the many institutions that carry out cultural activities. So, having diverse and many institutions is not a problem, but lack of coordination amongst those institutions was the problem. So we had the Ministry of Information or Media that was competing, and also we had another institution, which is the Office for Cultural Affairs, and also we have Qaboos University. What lacked is coordination amongst these institutions. There are some other institutions, secondary institutions. So, to what extent the strategy that you talked about, to what extent would it be able to find solutions to this problem in Oman? The last point that I would like to talk about, I would like to refer to what my friend Said Al-Hashimi, so the institutions working in the realm of culture, they work in their own closed rooms, doors, and the strategy. I'm talking about the Omani cultural strategy. I do not know when people started working on. I know that it ended, but I spent in excess of 5 years in the Ministry of Culture in Oman, and I know nothing about the strategy. And supposedly, I work in the cultural sphere. I was an advisor in the ministry, and I was expecting at least to be consulted not only as a person working there, but somebody who practices culture rights. So I think this problem applies to Qatar and to Kuwait as well. This was mentioned by Sundus as well. Hamad, and after that, Dr. Saad. We kindly ask you to be brief, Dr. Baqir as well. So we kindly ask you to be brief, please, Hamad. These are not questions. This is a discussion because the time is very, very limited. Abdulrahman, you talked about cultural institutions in the state of Qatar, that culture is not managed by institutions in the institutional sense of the word. And I would like you to clarify what you mean by those institutions. We have Qatar, and we have the Arabi Center, we have Qatar Foundation, Doha Institute. All of these institutions have a different scale altogether. So that is why I need to know, do these institutions target the community or not? If we can differentiate, then we can talk at great length about whether there is an interaction or not and what kind of interaction exists. Khaled, you remember the fall, so as if there is a regression, so as if that there is a kind of nostalgia to the 50s or 60s and 70s. And this is strange for me. Why? What is the benefit of having a culture that is directed by the outside? If I'm talking at the level of the elites now. My question to you, do you think and what is the relationship between the economic components? Because you concentrated on the political component. We'd like to move to Dr. Baqir and Dr. Saad as well. Dr. Saad is upset. Thank you very much. I would like to commend the papers that have been presented so far. Perhaps we don't have enough time to talk at great length about this subject, but my first observation, as it was mentioned by Mr. Abdulrahman when he talked about culture, I think that the GCC governments and the Arab governments and everywhere really, culture for them is something that is difficult to deal with. They do not know where to place it. The first to establish a Ministry of Culture was France, and nobody knew where to put it. So, should it be part of an institution, of a ministry? Because culture, in its definition, is difficult. Philosopher and scholars of anthropology, they are still in this polemic whereby they would be able to come up with a definition. So that is why it is difficult to indicate and be specific about what the role of culture is. Saudi Arabia also underlined this component of lack of clarity as to what culture means. This is a continuous issue. I would like to commend the observation by Mr. Abdurrahman. We have to pose questions when it comes to concepts such as CSOs, and there are so many other concepts that are used in a very easy way. And this leads to certain lack of clarity in terms of culture, and also the fact that we do not stop and pose questions about these concepts. This is very important. This should be done. And my last question is to Mr. Said. This is a question about the strategies. You mentioned a GCC cultural strategy, and I was wondering what that strategy was. We know that each and every country in the GCC what is the impact of this strategy? And does it reach the level where it is used and utilized in the community? So this is a problematic. We have an umbrella that is used. Thank you very much, Mr. Saad. And then we're going to move to Dr. Baqir and then Dr. Zaid. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So we cannot rely on memory as to who raised his hand or did not raise his hand. That is why this should be managed well. The second point that I would like to talk about with regard to the paper that was presented by Mr. Khaled, many countries that went through catastrophes, wars, occupation, and so on. So these countries regaining their health is going to be time consuming. There are so many countries that have entered into such issues, but they were not able to regain their good standing. So all of this is due to what has happened 30 years ago in Kuwait, for instance. The second point, Kuwait did not have a number of nationalistic groups. No, it had many people from the Muslim Brotherhood, from Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and many other countries. And those people had a presence in the cultural scene, in newspapers and so on, and they impacted and influenced that scene. The fact that they retreat from the Muslim Brotherhood Union, this only happened after the invasion of Kuwait. The other point that I would like to talk about, Mr. Abdulrahman talked about these components in education, in security. These have not led to anything. That is why I think that there is a new kind of generation. So Abdurrahman is the outcome of this phase, and Maryam also. And there are so many young people, Qataris, who have started really uh, becoming really bright in the work they are doing. So we would like to move to Mr. Zaid. Mr. Dr. Zaid. Thank you very much. Let's recognize that culture is second and not first in GCC countries and Arab communities in general. And consequently, we're talking about a product that is not in the forefront when it comes to decision makers. And until the decision makers understand that it is culture that would contribute to having a unified kind of program, because they think that it is politics that can do so. The second point that I would like to talk about, so culture has two kind of contexts. We have the context of ideas and the context of projects. So we have taken the world of concept of projects, and we left the world of ideas and concepts. So, because I am the head of the cultural program, so the first thing I did is that I got to see the strategy in the GCC, and we built our strategy based on that. But we found that the strategy is a part of a whole, because I revised the Saudi strategy and I found that it included all the points that it included. When we try to compare, this would be unjust, because GCC in general, they took from each other. They took from all these strategies and they tried to draft a kind of a comprehensive strategy. Where does the problem lie? The strategy has not been implemented, and we're talking about culture as being third after the political and the security level. Thank you very much. So I'm going to be very brief. So there are so many questions that have been posed. My question to Mr. Said Al Tarshi, you're an employee also in the Ministry of Culture. You're a researcher. Okay, you're a researcher. I would like to ask you about the cultural strategic plan in Oman in particular. Is this strategy viable? Can it be implemented, or is this only theoretical and therefore it cannot be implemented in the long term? My question is to Mr. Abdulrahman. The investment that was made by the state in culture, to what extent has taken into account the human component? Good evening. I would like to thank all the speakers. This is a kind of controversial question. So, this is the relationship between culture, power, politics, and religion. Dr. Khaled talked about this matter. Mr. Khaled, is this a kind of definitive kind of relationship? So does it mean that political development should include also cultural development? And if it is the case, how do you explain the absence of capital of the elite and individual initiatives? So these movements used to exist in order to build a theater, to build theatrical performances. So why should we wait or keep on waiting of what the authority is going to present to us? I agree with what the doctor had just said. Mr. Khalid, you talked about the regression of the liberals and intellectuals in Kuwait. Do you agree with me that because of this fact that it had been dissociated from what is happening in the street? And my question is to Mr. Abdulrahman. Culture should be liberated from a political perspective, and this seems to be difficult. We'd like to start with Dr. Khalid. Yes, 2 minutes. Thank you very much. So, when I go to what Sabah Al Ahmed talked about after 25 years of what had been established, and when I looked at the writings that have been made by Ahmed Zaki and others, it is clear that there was a linkage between these two components, but the consultations that have been made, the piece of advice when it comes to the team that established Al Arabi, they said that it should not be transformed into a kind of a propaganda. So that is why they were very clever when it comes to the kind of propaganda they wanted. So Kuwait was known in Algeria, Morocco, and other countries through Al Arabi, for instance, and this is one of the rare cases that existed in the Arab world. This with regard to the value. Dr. Ali, you talked about a kind of an exclusionist kind of culture, inoperative democracy, dysfunctional components. I do not think that this is not the conviction of the communities. If it reflects the culture of exclusion, this is kind of a judgment, yes. But the political expressions in Kuwait is due to the fact that there is a space where people can express themselves, whether these persons are in the right or left. You can work, you can establish CSOs, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to culture, this is a culture of fanaticism or exclusion. No, I do not consider it as such. And I do not think that the cultural or political elite is expressing somebody else's ideas. No, it is expressing its own convictions. But if there is an option towards the right, in normal circumstances, in democratic senses, there are institutions that try to limit the ambitions of populism. For instance, we have had a number of laws that had been cancelled. So there are institutions, whether the Constitutional Court or CSOs, they put pressure in this direction. So in a democratic space, you cannot force people to change their ideas or not to be Islamists or to be liberals and or patriotic. No, the CSOs are carrying out their role, and this is what is supposed to happen. And this what has happened in America when the Supreme Court dealt with the case of Trump. For instance, I'm talking about the Supreme institutions. These put an end to what is called populism. Dr. Rumehi, I would like to thank you for your intervention. And with regard to the question by Mr. Hamad, There is no feeling of nostalgia. This is a contemplation. And also, this is an attempt to explain the fall of the institution. And this is an attempt to understand the developments that have been undergone by the community. So, the community has changed a great deal in terms of how to the state imagine itself. Yes, this what was the case, and this does not mean that the old state was bad and that the new state is good, or the opposite. These are only contemplations. There are things that are good in the 70s, such as the constitutional solutions and so on. When it comes to the economic component, this was not clarified enough. With regard to Dr. Baqir, yes, the Islamic groups existed, but the paper talks about the cultural institutions. These are kind of forts for liberalism. So these institutions remained, and this presence is still there, and the presence of the liberals and political Islam, this still exists. So this presence is not a difficult matter. With regard to the presentation by or the question by Dr. Zaid, sorry, when it comes to projects, we left our projects and we concentrated on the sphere of culture, or the opposite. So it is the projects that lead to the establishment of ideas, as far as I know. I think that every act is linked to a political act. So there is an interlinkage between the two. So the idea is that in 76 we have seen a difference and so on, but in 1986 we have seen a regression when it comes to culture. So the relationship is not as simple as it has been delineated. What is important is the changes that we see in the world of ideas. So the space dedicated to freedom, it's much better, and but the policies are conservative. So Dr. Ibtihal, yes, these are separate from reality and from the community. Yes, these are the changes that we see around us, but how these elite do they make concessions when it comes to their discourse? This is a very thorny and difficult question. And here I'm going to conclude. We have seen the elite that has made many concessions. So, for instance, we have the third kind of sphere, and many of those they fear the impact of the liberal elite. Less than a minute. My first response about what Said Al-Hashimi had said. I would like to announce that there is a cultural strategy that is being prepared. Yes, we have seen a large participation from the cultural sphere, individuals, and CSOs, cultural institutions as well, and even other institutions as well, private institutions. There have been so many questions. So questionnaires have been distributed. Is it clear? Said, yes, there was a large participation despite or irrespective of the outcome. So the institution, so we cannot be unjust to it. Yes, I've talked about the procedures, and I think that we sent you a copy of it. The second question, same question, Dr. Fakhriya. I answered partially the question. So we start from the vision. So Oman to be a pioneering destination. So you said that my comparison between the two strategies was unjust. So it was a scientific kind of comparison. So I was just comparing here. So when we look at the Omani view and compare it with the GCC view, I reviewed the other strategies, and these comparisons are for us to understand. I would like to salute Dr. Abdullah Al-Jasmi. I would like to thank him because he is part of the team that prepared the strategy. So what have the GCC countries done? So we criticize the strategy, but we cannot be unjust to them. But when I'm asked, is this up to the aspirations of person that loves the GCC and so on? No, we aspire to have a much bigger work when it comes to the failure in the projects that have been undertaken. Here we need to talk about values, the symbols, the beliefs, the ideas. What are the values that prevail in the GCC? We consume everything. So the project of Kalima. So how many GCC persons are in there? Would like to move to Mr. Abdulrahman. I'm going to answer very quickly the questions that had been posed, talking about the diversity in terms of these components. So the paper concentrated on the cultural institution represented by the Ministry of Culture, and since it was established in the 70s up to now. So, amongst the examples that you mentioned when it comes to the Educational City project and Qatar, I would like to add to that Qatar museums, and perhaps I can talk also about other institutions, journalistic institutions that reflect the daily concerns of citizens, individuals in the state of Qatar. But I concentrated on the framework that is linked to the cultural institutions because first, these are the relevant or concerned institution when it comes to managing cultural activities, and it is dedicated to the inside, but the other institutions have different circumstances and context for what it calls established. And that is why the cultural component is divided and it is not unified. And this is a GCC phenomenon. For instance, the Qatar it is dedicated to the Arab world. This is clear from its activities. And the education city, this is reflective of the new methodology that has been undertaken, including the structure of those institutions. That is why I dedicated this paper to the institutions that are concerned by local matters, and I studied how this institution moved from social, institutional, and semi-institutional projects and initiatives. So when we talk about the relationship between vital investment and the human component, So the human component was present in this equation of investment that was established by the state in different sectors, but that was not the only component. So there are so many others that the state tried to underline regionally and globally. One last point is to liberate culture from the political dimension. I mentioned that this is the political phenomenon that is prevalent. And as Mr. Zaid had said, so what is cultural started coming next. But the cultural matter is the outcome, an indirect outcome of the interaction of the social and the historical and the political. And this is something that I expanded on in my paper. This is a phenomenon that is Khaliji, GCC par excellence. Thank you.